Hello, and welcome to the second webinar in our 2021 Hear from the Expert series. I hope everyone is keeping well during this challenging time. We're very pleased that today we can offer the MS community this webinar on demystifying MS research. We would like to acknowledge Bristol Myers Squibb and PendaPharm for their sponsorship to make this event possible. My name is Sharon Roman, and I'm a patient partner and volunteer with the MS Society of Canada. As a patient partner, I collaborate with researchers and those in the healthcare industry to provide my patient perspective in a bid to help improve healthcare. I'm looking forward to this webinar, as I also have MS and often try to evaluate study results as they apply to my own situation. So I'm very happy to be moderating this webinar. A few housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded for future viewing on our YouTube channel, and no participant names or identifying information is being displayed. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the chat box on your screen. We'll have a Q&A session after our speaker presents. And we're also streaming live to Facebook, so hello to all our Facebook Live viewers. Your questions are also welcome. Today's webinar is meant to help you gain confidence in navigating the complex world of MS research. We will spend some time reviewing key questions to ask yourselves as you are attempting to evaluate research and its applicability to the course of your own MS. Our expert will also discuss concepts that are important in research and will dive into the structure of research articles in order for you to be able to find the key pieces of information you are looking for to help inform your decision-making and discussions with healthcare providers. The MS Society does not approve, endorse, or recommend any specific product or therapy, but provides information to assist individuals in making their own decisions. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Julie Petrin. Dr. Petrin completed her doctoral degree in rehabilitation sciences at Queen's University. Julie has been conducting research in the MS field for over 7 years in areas of fatigue self-management, comorbidities, and access to healthcare for Canadians with MS. It was her own diagnosis at the age of 17 that led her on this path and continues to drive her career aspirations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Petrin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here today and to learn more about research and trying to, as the title says, demystify what research is. And thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I just wanted to give you a little bit more about my story so that you understand where I'm coming from when I talk about demystifying research. So as Sharon said, when I was 17, I was diagnosed with MS. And I remember being diagnosed and having no clue what MS was and what it really meant to my future. I was pretty scared. And at the time, I was finishing up my social science degree in CEGEP in Quebec. And I was deciding what's next for me. I was also trying to search for all of the answers to MS and trying to understand what was going on inside my body. And I wanted to learn some way to try and regain some small portion of control over what was going on. And so this is when I started to realize that there's a lot of content out there, and I was feeling overwhelmed by the amount of research that was available. And oftentimes how some of the research was contradictory. How was I supposed to know which research was actually good? Well, that kind of put me on a track of really enjoying research and trying to learn about research. So I decided to continue my studies in neuroscience, and then my master's, and then my PhD. And now here I am, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Saskatchewan, working with Dr. Sarah Donkers. And so along the path, I've accrued a lot of information and knowledge about MS and about some of the key tools that can be used to help you assess research and how that research might be applicable to you. So that's really what we have on the agenda for today. I want to help you gain the knowledge that you require and gain some tools that can help you assess research and how it may be applicable to you. So we'll start off by the basics of any research article, which is what is the actual structure of a scientific paper, a research paper, a manuscript. These are all synonymous words for the same thing. And when you see a research article, it'll always start off with the title, followed by the authors and affiliations. And I mention this just because in a few slides, we'll talk about why authors and affiliations are actually important to take a look at. But the first main important piece of information is the abstract. Now, this will summarize the entire article. It can be either structured or unstructured, so it can be broken down into small little summaries of an intro, methods, results, and discussion, or it can be one big paragraph which summarizes the full study. And this is always free to access, and it's a very good place to start when you're looking at a research article. Now, the next part of a research article or a scientific paper is the introduction. So here, this is where the researcher aims to introduce the research problem and provide you with the information that you need to actually understand why they're doing this study. So they'll generally present a problem, which will culminate in a research question or a research aim. And that's what they're trying to essentially answer. So they're trying to say, by posing this research question, we're going to deal with the problem that we just introduced. And so at the end of the intro, you'll always want to make sure that you find the research question. Then you have your methods section. So this is where the authors will describe how research is carried out. And so the main things you're looking for here are the study design, are the research approach. You really want to pay close attention to the participants, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in detail later on, as well as the outcome. So what is it that they're actually trying to change or measure? So if it's quality of life, what tool are they actually using to quantify quality of life? And then, of course, the analysis. So what is the actual statistical analysis or method of analysis that they've used? Now, a good method section gives you, the reader, enough detail that another researcher could come along and could replicate the entire study. Then we have our results. And to be honest, I wouldn't spend much time on the results when you're trying to assess a research article. And that's just because the results are generally graphs and figures, quotes, or statistics. And you generally require a lot of information to try and understand whether these are done right. I have a hard time if I'm not in my own field of study. And so what I would say here is that the results will tell you what the basic data showed. There's no interpretations here. It's the exact results of the study. What's more important or more interesting to look at is your discussion. So that's the last main part of this paper. And this is where the researchers will interpret the data and interpret their findings. So what do the results actually suggest? How does it fit with the rest of the research that's out there? So if I'm looking at fatigue management, how do my new results fit in with the old results? What does this actually mean to the broader society and the people with MS? And how might relevant groups of stakeholders, so persons with MS, maybe neurologists, maybe physiotherapists, how might they use this evidence? Now, another really important aspect of the discussion is the limitations. So every good discussion will also have a section that talks about some of the limitations of the methods. So maybe these are some of the drawbacks and things that might lead to bias or things that they would change if they could change. And so it's always good to make sure that that is there. Now, there are a few additional points in a scientific paper that I wanted to touch on. So the first are the references. So you'll always have references at the end of the paper, and whenever you're reading the introduction in the background, you might read a statistic or a previous study that discussed something, and they reference that. So if you're interested in seeing what they were talking about, you can go to the reference and put the reference into Google and search for that reference and look for that scientific paper as well. The next two things are the statement of funding. So this is essentially where researchers credit the people or the organizations that help fund the research. And then finally, we generally have a conflict of interest statement. So as the name suggests, this is where researchers declare any sort of relationship they have that might bias the research or lead to a conflict of interest. So that's the basic structure. And now we'll go through and talk a little bit more about, now that we know that, what the questions are to ask yourself as you are evaluating a research article. So let's get going. So where do you start if you come across a media release? So maybe you're not looking for something in particular and something just pops up in your news feed. And so I've pulled this recent publication from newsmedical.net. The first thing you want to do is always to make sure that you can get the primary source content. So you want to find that original research article. You want to make sure that the media isn't skewing or putting their own interpretation on the info. So anytime I come across a media release, I look for either the journal or the author or a full reference. In this example that I've pulled for you here, you'll see that they've included both the journal as well as the full journal reference and the DOI, which is the digital identifier. And usually you click the digital identifier and it links you directly to the research article. Now, if you didn't have that, you can access the original research article by, if the link isn't there, by going to either PubMed, Google Scholar, journ.org, or Cochrane databases. So these are all really good places to start. You would type in the title of the paper or potentially the journal name, and you would be able to find that research article that way. So on that note, where is research actually published? Well, most academic research is published in journals. Now, not all journals are equal. Some are more reputable than others. However, if they have a peer review system, which we'll get into next, it's a good marker that it's a good academic journal. You can also look at the editorial board and make sure that the editorial board are people in well standing. In health research, there are some journals of the highest that are highest viewed are the Lancet, are the New England Journal of Medicine, or Nature, or Cell. In Canada, we have the Canadian Journal of Medicine. There are also multiple rehabilitation journals and MS-specific journals. Now, these are some of the MS-specific journals that when I'm looking for research, I will start with. So Multiple Sclerosis Journal is a really good source, International Journal of MS Care, and the Multiple Sclerosis and Related Disorders. Now, there's one last distinguishing feature when you're looking at journals, and this is whether a journal is open access or not. And what this means is that journals are generally require a subscription. So that means you go to find an article, and I'm sure you've come across this, you get this screen saying, you need to pay for the article, and that's because they require a subscription. And so with open access, and we're moving more towards this, journals are trying to move towards a model where people can actually view all of the research for free. And so open access journal means that people who want to read the research actually have free access. Whereas if it's not open access, you will most likely only be able to get to the abstract. And this is, I I'm just putting this up here because don't get discouraged. First of all, you can still evaluate research based on the abstract. And most of the questions we're going to go through today, we can look at directly from the abstract. And then you can assess, is this a good article or not? Does this relate to me? Would this be useful for me to have? And if you say yes to all of those questions, then you can actually try and get a full copy of these full text, even if it's not available or you need to pay, by simply emailing the corresponding author. So I was talking about author and affiliations. Well, in each article, and you can see here, I've highlighted the section that says correspondence. So this is one of my journal articles, and you'll see that they have my email listed there. So if you wanted a copy per se of this article because you didn't have access to it, you could email me and ask. And most researchers are more than happy to share their research with persons with MS. So if you're not starting from a media release, but you're just searching for information, a really good place to start is PubMed. And I like PubMed because this is where a lot of journals are published here. I did this test, I think about last week, and when I typed in multiple sclerosis in PubMed, it came up with 94,471 results. So there's a lot of articles there. But the other thing I really like about PubMed are these functions here. So you can click off the text availability. So you can choose whether or not you want free full text, and then it'll only show you the articles that you can get for free. Or you can click on just looking at the abstracts. Further, you can look at the different article types, and we'll get to the different types of articles in a few slides, but you can click, let's say, if you just want to see randomized controlled trials or just reviews, you can select that as well. And finally, you can also select the date. So if you want to look at research within the past 10 years, you can do that, or you can look at research within the past year. So then you can choose an article and start doing your evaluation from there. So now you have your primary source and you're looking at your research article. Now, what's the first question to ask? Well, is the article peer reviewed? And I know you've probably heard this word before, but what does it actually mean? Well, it means that a system of independent experts within the field are going to review other researchers' work. So the other researchers need to make sure that the article being published meets the scientific standards. So they're doing their job to make sure that this is a good research article that warrants publication. And if they come up with an issue, the author has to fix those issues before it gets published. But what articles actually go through peer review? Well, pretty much any good scientific article will have a peer review system where 2 to 3 independent experts are actually going to review each research article. Government and non-academic organizations are rarely peer reviewed. This is not to say that they're not good at all. That's not what I'm saying. It's just there's less scrutiny that goes on. And so anytime I come across a paper or even a report from the government, if it's not reviewed, you just want to be a little bit more cautious about the interpretations that they make, and just make sure that the report that you're reading isn't trying to meet their agenda points or the government's agenda point or policy points, because there is no peer review here. So you do have to be a little bit more, you need to scrutinize that a little bit more. The next thing you want to ask, kind of along the same lines, is, well, who conducted and who funded the work? So knowing this information is really helpful because it can help you determine whether there's any conflict of interests. So to do that, you can look again at the authors list and affiliations, as well as the funding and support. And so you need to make sure that the people funding the research didn't have some sort of vested interest in the outcome of the study. So it can be useful to think who might benefit from the findings and to what extent they were involved in the research, so that you can properly assess whether they may have may have had some different interpretations of the data that meets their need. So as you can see here, the funding and conflict of interest section is at the end of a research article right before the references. So I've just pulled an example here for you so that you see what that looks like. The next thing is there a clear research question? And this is because, or aim, also known as objective or purpose. The idea here is that you want to make sure that there's a clear question, because the research, the methods and the results and discussion should all be related to that research question. So in order for a research article to be complete and to make sense and to be coherent, it needs to all start from that clear research question. It also helps you as a reader determine what the point of this research study actually is. So this is my paper again, just because it's easier for me to use my own work. Here you'll find the research question or aim in both the abstract as well as right at the end of an introduction. So usually within the last paragraph of the introduction, you'll see the research question. So before we get into the next set of questions, we need to do a little bit of an overview of research approaches and different study designs. So we can there are different ways that we can categorize research. Here, what I've done is looked at research approaches. And you'll see here that there's 3 different types. So we have primary studies, and that's where researchers will collect and analyze new data. We have secondary studies, and this is where researchers will analyze data that already exists. And then we have tertiary studies, and this is reviews or synthesis of previous studies. So it takes both primary and secondary studies and puts them together and synthesizes the information, and that's a tertiary study. What we'll focus on today is mostly primary and secondary studies, and at the end of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about tertiary studies. We also have different types of health research. Now, most of what we'll talk about today, or actually all of what we'll talk about today, is most relevant to human studies. So this is where we have human participants in studies. But before that happens, we do have in vitro studies and animal studies. So in vitro studies, and these are both the studies that you typically think about when you're thinking about research laboratories. And so in vitro studies are when researchers are looking at cell level and at the microorganism level. And in MS, these are research papers that will mention B cells and CD4 plus T cells and oligodendrocytes. Whereas animal studies, what you'll see most commonly is the MS mouse model. And so that's called EAE, or the experimental autoimmune encephalomyelitis. And these studies are used prior to human studies. But as I said, today we will focus primarily on human studies. Now, when we're looking at different types of study designs or research approaches, there are different different research questions that researchers pose. And so I've broken them down into different categories, and we'll go through questions to ask ourselves if we're looking at research within each of those categories. So we'll start first with number 1 here. So researchers can aim to evaluate a treatment or an intervention. They could also aim to explore different risk factors. They can explore how common something is. And they can also explore a person's experiences or perspectives related to something. And then, of course, they can use a combination of these research methods. And finally, referring to those tertiary studies, we can review all of the primary research regarding any of these approaches. So you'll see here the first 3 points are what we call quantitative research. And so this is where we're using numbers and statistics, Whereas our fourth point is our qualitative data, and this is where we're using interviews and focus groups. And number 5 would be a combination of both the quantitative and the qualitative. So we will go through point by point and go through some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves depending on which type of research approach we're looking at. So before we get into it, I just wanted to point out, when you first take a look at a primary research example, so this is, you'll notice that it's primary research because you will have here, you'll have original research paper written at the top. So you know it's not a review. You'll also see the affiliation and the authors. And finally, you'll have the correspondence, which I alluded to, and you'll have that objective so that you can figure out what type of research approach this is. So in this case, this study aimed to investigate the healthcare access experiences. So as soon as you generally see the word experiences, you can know that you're looking at qualitative research, and we'll get to that in a few slides. So now let's get back to these questions and look at what type of study designs or research approaches are being used and what questions to ask. So the first one we'll look at are research that aim to evaluate a treatment or an intervention. So most of the work related to treatments or interventions will be using an experimental design. And what this means is that the researcher will control which participants in the group receive a treatment or an intervention and which ones receive a control. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And these ones that are experimental designs frequently referred to as trials. Now we can have multiple different types of trials. So there's intervention trials, rehab intervention trials, clinical trials, drug trials. And I've listed some examples of some of the different types of experimental designs that you will commonly come across in research. We obviously don't have time to get into all of them, but we'll explain what some of these words mean in the next coming slides. So what are some of the key questions to ask yourself if you know that it's a trial that you're looking at? Well, the first thing is there a control group? So that's a group that does not receive the active treatment. And this group is also known as the placebo group. And so as for an example, let's say we're doing a fatigue treatment, fatigue treatment, and the active intervention is energy management website. And then the next group is a control group where they would receive usual care. So what anyone else with MS would get if they came into the doctor saying that they had fatigue. And then that group, the usual care group, would be considered the control group. And the intervention group would be the group receiving the treatment. So the control group is really important because essentially you can actually compare the effects of the new treatment to those, you can make sure that what the outcomes that you actually see at the end of your trial are due to the treatment and not external factors, because you're going to control for different external factors. Okay, are the groups randomized? So this is where the participants are assigned to either the treatment group or the control group, and this is done in a random fashion. There are multiple different programs that randomize participants. And the only thing I would say, randomization is extremely important, but another thing that you want to check is whether or not in the results, the researchers mention the differences between the two groups. So they should always make sure, the researchers should always reference whether or not there are any big differences between those two groups. Sorry about that. And if there is, then it's harder to interpret whether the data is true, because it's hard to know if let's say you randomized the 50 people with MS, But for some reason, somehow the randomization happened that all 25 in the intervention group had relapsing remitting MS and all 25 in the control group had primary progressive MS. Well, now, how do I know if the intervention worked or if it's just because there's a difference between the two groups? So that's something you just have to keep in mind. Finally, the next step in the trial that you always want to ask is the study blinded? So this is the most reliable trials will be blinded, at least to the researchers, because they're the ones who will do the data analysis and the write-up, and they want to be blinded to whether or not which group actually received the treatment, so that they're not going to, so essentially they'll remain bias-free in their analysis. And you can have single-blinded, double-blinded, and triple-blinded studies. So single-blinded meaning the researchers don't know which group they're in. The double-blinded could be that the participants don't know or the interventionists don't know either. Okay, so a trial example, in this case, it's really easy to find out whether it's a trial because in this case, the title is actually randomized controlled trial, and most articles that are randomized controlled trial will have it in their title. But you can also look to the objective as well as the methods. So if you look at the methods per se here, you'll see that persons with MS were included in the study and randomized into group 1, group 2, or group 3. And they state that group 3 is the control group. So here they have 2 active interventions and 1 control group. Now, I don't know from here whether the study has been blinded, but I know that there has a control group and that the participants have been randomized. So those are both really good signs. So let's see if it's been blinded. To do that, you would look more so in the method. So I pulled the method section, looked up the participants, and the first sentence here in the participants section of this paper, you'll see this is a single blind randomized controlled 3-arm trial. So this is looking really promising for the for essentially showing that this is good evidence. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that anytime you're looking at a clinical trial, all clinical trials have been registered at clinicaltrials.gov. So if you want to go take a look at any of the clinical trials that are going on, you can go to this website and find all the trials there. The next thing that's really important, if you think that the study is well done and you think the results look promising and you actually want to give it a try or think that it might be useful to apply in your life, you can go to the methods section, and there's always a section on the intervention description. So I pulled that here, and you can see exactly what the intervention comprised of. So that's how you would actually be able to implement that in your life. Well, we can also look at we can also aim to evaluate a treatment or an intervention without using an experimental design. So we can use an observational design as well. So this is when a researcher does not control if their participants receive the treatment or the control. And these studies are generally referred to as population or epidemiological studies. And there are 3 main types. So we have case control studies. So in the case of MS, we would potentially have the case as someone with MS and control as someone without MS. Cross-sectional studies, this is when you take a snapshot in time. So you're looking at one given time at a big group of people with MS per se. And then we have longitudinal studies, also known as cohort studies, and they'll follow a group of participants over time. Again, there's no assorting them into groups. We're kind of just observing how the group progresses. So there's a few terms to keep in mind when we talk about observational design. So these are things like prospective and retrospective, because you'll see these in research articles all the time. Prospective means that you're looking at a group of people and you're following them into the future. Retrospective means that you're looking back in time. So you're looking at older data. In case control studies, you'll often see the term called matched groups. And this is important because it ensures that the participant group, so the case, let's say people with MS, are actually matched to controls on important characteristics. So these can be things like age, sex, year, obviously, year since diagnosis is not applicable if I'm using the MS and non-MS example, but you want to have those important characteristics captured and matched. And lastly, on the observational design, when you're looking at the different types, so case control, cross-sectional, longitudinal is generally considered the best observational design as it allows you to capture changes that occur over time. In all of these situations, it's definitely less of a rigorous method than the experimental design because you're not able to control for a lot of other factors that may be leading to some of the conclusions you're gathering. So a randomized controlled trial is generally better viewed than a case control design in terms of evidence. Now, I wanted to end this section on a quick note related to pilot or feasibility studies. So you'll frequently see interventions that say pilot randomized controlled trial or feasibility trial. And if you see these words, I just want you to take note that these aren't studies that you should be using to inform your decisions. The goal of these studies is really to determine if the treatment or the intervention warrants any further investigation. So you would need follow-up research to really say that what they're looking at is good. I mean, of course, you can follow this research along if you think it looks interesting, but I wouldn't make any sort of management decisions based on feasibility or pilot studies. Now, the second one is when researchers are aiming to explore risk factors. So this is observational studies as well because we're not grouping people. And these studies are really used to determine if there's a link between two phenomena. So you're trying to find out whether there's a relationship between two variables. So for example, you're looking at the relationship between obesity and relapse rate in MS. So we'll take a look at an example in the next slide. But they're the same designs that we just saw in the intervention studies. So they'll use case control studies, cross-sectional studies, and longitudinal studies. But now instead of looking at an intervention, they're looking at the risk of the relationship and the risk of developing something. So here we have an example that is a risk factor example. And so if you were to look at the title, it's a little bit hard to determine what type of research it is. But if you go down to the objectives and the methods, then you can kind of get a better idea of what the approach is that they're using. So here they say they're aiming to explore whether increased adipocyte mass expressed as body mass index and increased serum lipids influence CSF inflammation and disease severity. So they're trying to see if one thing, in this case, BMI and increased serum lipids, had an influence on something else, in this case, inflammation and disease severity. So you know that they're looking at a relationship here. And then further, if you go into the methods, you'll see that they state in this cross-sectional study. So you see here that it's an observational study. So it's an observational study that's looking at a relationship between two events. So you're looking at this type of research approach. Now, I wanted to take a second to caution everyone. So if you look at the results here, you'll see that they state that there's a positive correlation that emerged between body mass index and the EDDS score, which is a common measure of disability in MS. And so the one thing I really want to point out here is that correlation does not imply causation. So just because two things are associated to one another, that does not mean that one thing is causing the other. It just means that they are associated to one another. We don't know if one is actually causing the other. So just keep that in mind. That's a very important takeaway. Then we have studies that aim to explore how common something is. So generally you'll see this is health surveys are the most common thing. So if you've ever answered a Health Canada survey or a Statistics Canada survey, even a healthcare satisfaction survey, it's generally going to involve questions to get answers about specific health questions, health issues, and how common those health issues are. So they'll use the same terms here as the observational study, but using surveys. So you can use longitudinal surveys, which survey over time, cross-sectional survey, which is one at a time, or case control surveys. So a survey example here, if you're trying to determine if it's a survey, it's pretty straightforward, as most titles will say it's a survey. In this case, you see that it's a survey. In the methods, you see that they conducted a survey of participants. And then you can look at the results as well. And you'll see that they're just reporting percentages. They're describing how common something is. Then we can move away from those quantitative numbers and statistics. And there's researchers who try and attempt to understand persons with MS's perspectives, perceptions, and experiences. And so here, there are multiple different types of qualitative designs. We won't get into that, but these are some words that you might come across when you're looking at qualitative research. These are all designs that are used, and most commonly, we use focus groups and interviews to collect information. And if you want to delve a little bit more deep into how qualitative research can actually, if you can find out what good qualitative research is and what it isn't, you can go to, there's a resource called COREQ, so C-O-R-E-Q, for evaluating qualitative research. I don't have time, unfortunately, today to go into that. I won't spend much time on the qualitative example. However, you'll see anytime you see the words experiences, you're more likely looking at a qualitative example. Then, as I alluded to earlier, we have a combination of the approaches. So some researchers use a combination of different research methods, and they do that because that can enhance the research, essentially. We use quantitative research to try and measure things, and we can use qualitative research to try and understand things. So when we mix both of those together, it allows us to both measure and understand. So it capitalizes on the strengths of both approaches while minimizing the drawbacks of both approaches. Now, the most commonly used mixed methods approach is using a survey or an intervention mixed with either a focus group or an interview. And this is becoming much more common in practice. However, again, it's slightly harder to assess whether the quality of research is good because qualitative research and quantitative research are assessed differently. So if you're looking at a mixed methods example and you're trying to find out if it is, well, luckily in the title, it's generally written. But if we look more closely at the objective as well as the methods, you'll see that I've highlighted, they have here individuals were invited to complete a web-based survey, and then they were followed up via telephone interviews. So you know that they've used both qualitative and quantitative research here. So you're looking at a mixed methods. Now we're getting to our tertiary research. And so this, my friends, is the holy grail of research. So it's what most researchers consider the highest level of evidence, are systematic reviews. And your systematic review can have or cannot have a meta-analysis, but essentially this is where you can take all of, let's say, again, using the fatigue intervention as an example, we found one study that showed that energy management programs decreased fatigue in people with MS, but we only saw one study. So yeah, okay, this looks promising, but if you take 15 or 30 studies and they all show the same thing, now that's looking like some solid evidence that you can really apply into your life. So this is what medical doctors will generally use to change their practice. And this is the most reliable research that you would want to use when you're trying to inform your management and your daily practice as well. There are other types of reviews. So there are narrative reviews and scoping reviews, and these are just not quite as rigorous. Systematic reviews are your best bet, because they really are providing you with an overview of the overall state of the evidence. And using these good quality reviews can really help you avoid being misled by some unreliable study, primary or secondary studies. So here's an example. So the Cochrane library or the Cochrane database is the best place to get systematic reviews. Unfortunately, a lot of the time you won't have access to the full text. However, they do a very good job at their summaries. So here you'll see that there's the first thing you'll see is that it has intervention review written, which means that they're looking at all of the different interventions. So if we look at the abstract, you'll see if you look here at the selection criteria, you'll see that they've only selected randomized controlled trials or controlled clinical trials. So already very good forms of research to examine the effects of dietary intervention. And what's really good about Cochrane as well is that they provide authors' conclusions. The main thing you want to look at in your results is to see how many studies they actually looked at. So in this case, they looked at 30 different studies of full text review to actually come to their author conclusions. Now, as I've been kind of alluding to throughout this whole presentation, there are some types of evidence that are better than others, but we're in health sciences, we're starting to move slowly away from this, just because, as I alluded to, researchers use different types of research questions and different types of research to address those research questions. And so it's sometimes quite hard to, let's say, if we're using qualitative research, to classify qualitative research on this type of level of evidence. However, we can say, like, if we're applying research into practice, our best bet is to look at those randomized controlled trials and those systematic reviews. So a few final overall questions to ask yourself, independent of what type of research article you're looking at. When you go to the methods section, you always want to know what is the population description and the context. So make sure that the sample of people that are included in the research study is actually representative of your situation. Are they about the same age? Do they have the same type of MS? Are they dealing with the same type of issues? Is the context similar? And always take a look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria. It's actually really interesting to look at, but a lot of intervention studies will exclude a lot of people with MS that have comorbidities and things that are actually quite common. And so you may not, what the research found may not actually be applicable to your given situation. So I would always say, go look at what the population description is. Then, was the sample size justified? So the sample size is essentially just the number of participants that completed the study. It's sometimes really hard to figure out whether the researchers had the right sample size, but what you can do is at least look in the methods and make sure that the researchers or the authors have verified that they have justified their reasoning and maybe have a reference for why they've chosen that sample size. And finally, when you're looking at your discussion section, I'm skipping the results because, as I said, I do think the results are a very complicated matter and they're difficult to understand if you're not familiar with the specific analysis that's used. And that's for anyone looking at research articles. I find sticking to the discussion makes more sense. And you can address the following questions in the discussion. So do the authors answer the original research question or aim? What are the major implications of their work? And what are the main limitations of their work? So I pulled my discussion as an example. So the box in the right-hand corner was my original research question. So we were trying to find out, investigate the healthcare access experiences of Canadians with MS. And as you'll see, I start my discussion with describing those experiences. So I'm answering that question immediately. Now, I also have a full section on what are the strengths and limitations of the study. So you can go and see where some of the limitations of the studies are and how it may not be as generalizable to everyone. And then finally, what are the practical next steps? And so these are those takeaways. So there's a whole section here for those takeaways. So these are some of the things you want to look for in your discussion. Then I've just provided you with a bunch of resources that I hope that you can use later to help evaluate research in the when you're looking in the future. So the first few are understanding science, then we have critical appraisal tools, then we have our Cochrane Library, and I've also included reliable sources of MS news. So if you're looking for updates on MS research, these are some of the places I would look first. And that is it for me. I'd love to thank you all for tuning in and listening and learning a little bit about research.
Wow. That was great, really. Thank you so much, Dr. Petrin. That was informative, it was in-depth, and you helped us learn how to demystify complex research papers. Now, specifically, I'm so glad you touched on media slant, funding, and gave specific titles for reliable MS journals, because credible sources are so important when considering information. And I'll remember to look for systematic reviews if I can, and look at the population description. Now, let's get to some questions from our audience. We have a question from Facebook. What are the reasons a study might be paused?
Well, I can think of a good one right now, COVID. I know a lot of researchers going through a lot of pauses actually, because they can't be interacting with participants. So if, let's say you're running a rehabilitation study, you need to be in contact with patients. Some have been able to move to an online platform, which is great. But even then, you have to pause the research to set all of that up and set up all those logistics as well. So that's one thing. Another thing could be if there is an adverse reaction or something, like something happens to one of the patients, generally speaking, then we will pause research as well to make sure that everything, we can understand what's going on before we move forward. I'm trying to think of other reasons. Those are two that come to mind.
Thank you. Another question. Why are some open access journals called predatory journals?
Yeah. Okay. So predatory journals are mostly predatory towards authors. So it's more so the researchers that have to be careful, because they will try and get you to publish, because it is the authors. Whenever a reader gets to read an article that's free, it's the authors who've paid to make it free. And so they will oftentimes ask researchers, oh, we have this new journal, please come and submit. And then, you know, you have this $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 fee to pay. Now, if a open access journal ever asks a reader to pay, that is completely predatory, and that should not happen. Open access journal means that it should be free to all.
And could you reiterate what COREQ, C-O-R-E-Q?
Yeah, so it's C-O...
What it's for?
Yeah, so C-O-R-E-Q is what researchers who work in qualitative research, so the qualitative research is growing as a field in health science, and people are understanding that it's really relevant to especially the healthcare experience. And so, of course, it's a newer field, and so we're starting to develop ways to assess whether or not qualitative research is meeting a certain standard. And so researchers are now being asked to complete this checklist. So COREC is a list of items that researchers should be making sure that they address to ensure that their qualitative research is highly rigorous and meets the standards of science. And so if everyone has access to that, so you can, as a reader, pull that up as well. If you just type it into Google, it'll come up. And you can look at those questions and actually answer the questions yourself. And then you can sort of do an evaluation of the qualitative research using that tool.
Thank you. And here's one about coordination. How is MS research coordinated so it is not duplicated nationally or globally? Or I suppose, is it?
To be honest, it's not. I will preface that as, however, that at least, Canadian-wide, MS is a pretty small research world. A lot of researchers know each other and have an idea of who's doing what and collaborate with each other when we have a certain area of interest that we know that that person is really strong in. And so we sort of talk that way in terms of coordinating what our research projects. But internationally and globally and so on, there isn't really a coordination system in research. It really is about, ooh, I have this idea, let's try and get it out there before the other researcher does. That's one. But then it's also in research, you do want to have replication of work. So in order to get those systematic reviews, we need to have multiple researchers actually looking at the same things so that they can say, yeah, we all found the same results and they're all showing the same things. So now we have pretty strong evidence that this is true moving forward and that we want to move forward with this.
Good point. And final question. Can you tell us about the importance of dates? How old is too old for results to be valid?
I think, to be honest, that it depends on what you're looking at. There is some, I like to keep it to about 10 years. But some things there's some things that just don't change. But in general, if you're looking at trials, interventions, and stuff like that, 10 years is as far back as I would go. I would, if you can, try and find stuff within 5 years, because MS research is advancing quite quickly. And so I would say 10 at the latest, 5 if you can. And if you're looking at things, there are some things that haven't changed, and you want to go back or if you even want to look at the history of something, you might want to look at some of those older papers as well.
Okay, thank you. That's unfortunately all the time we have for questions today.
Well, if anyone does have any questions, I think, is my email available somewhere for people? I do believe so. So feel free to send me an email, and if you have any questions, I'm here.
That's generous of you. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you to everyone who's watched for their interest in this topic.
Thank you.
I'd like to take this opportunity to once again thank our speaker, Dr. Petrin. We're so lucky you've been able to take the time to share your expertise with us. You've certainly helped clarify the structure of a study and given us the tools to be able to assess how applicable a research paper is to ourselves. And I find this very valuable information you've shared, so thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure being here. And good luck, everyone.
So before we wrap up, I'd like to let our viewers know that there will be 2 virtual MS Connect conferences in 2021. The spring event is coming up on April 28th and 29th. Join us for informative sessions, social connection, interactive exercise and wellness sessions, and so much more. Registration is available on the mssociety.ca website. And our partners at Can Do MS that's cando-ms.org, in the US also offer monthly webinars, and on May 5th, you can join them to learn about mood and cognition symptoms in MS. I also want to remind you about the MS Society of Canada's Knowledge Network, which is staffed by trained navigators to answer questions related to MS. You can see on the slide how to connect with them through phone, email, and live chat. Finally, webinars like this are critical to ensuring people living with MS have all of the information they need to make the best decisions for themselves. By registering and fundraising for MS Walk and MS Bike, you can help continue to make these sessions available, all while connecting with members of the MS community from across Canada. Visit mswalks.ca or msbike.ca to learn more. And our virtual MS Walk this year is May 30th, which is World MS Day. A final reminder that you will be receiving a survey following this webinar, and I encourage you to fill it out and let us know if this information was valuable to you. Again, thank you to Bristol Myers Squibb and Penda Farm for their sponsorship. Thank you to Dr. Petrin and to all of you for participating in today's webinar. Take care and have a good day.